Hi everyone, it's Hayden from Altus One, and today we're going to be talking about percentages and other similar topics like decimals and simple interest. Percentages and those other topics come up really frequently, so it's important that you know how to tackle those questions effectively. So, percentages can be understood by breaking up the word percent. Per means of and cent means 100. So a percent or percentage means a number that can be represented as a fraction of 100. So 20% is the same as 20 over 100. And 3/4 can be equated to 75 over 100 and therefore 75%. We also need to be able to understand the relationship between percentages, decimals, and fractions. Fractions and decimals can be easily converted, whilst decimals and percentages can be converted as shown here. A percentage must be divided by 100 to become a decimal, whilst a decimal must be multiplied by 100 to become a percentage. Let's have a go at this question. An item is listed at $200 before a 10% store discount. After the discount, a 6% sales tax is applied. What is the final price? Well, the first discounted price can be found by subtracting 10% from the $200. So 10% of $200 is $20. So a discount of $20 subtracted from the $200 means that we have a $180 item after the 10% discount. And then a 6% sale tax is applied. So we find 6% of 180 by multiplying 180 by either 0.06 or 6 over 100. We multiply by 6 over 100. That leaves us with $10.80. So our final price is $190.80. Let's have a look at this one. Vincent initially has a certain amount of money. He gives 40% to his brother, spends 10% of the remaining on video games, and then spends the remaining $17 on a gift for his friend Keith. We want to express the money he spent on the gift as a percentage of the total amount of money. My first step is going to be letting X equal the amount of money he initially has. If he gives 40% to his brother, he has 60% for himself. So, after he gives 40%, I'm going to say 0.6x is the amount of money that he has left, 60% of x. He then spends 10% of the remaining on video games. So if he spends 10% of that, he retains 90%. So I'm going to do 0.6x times 0.9 for the 90% he retains after he spends 10%, which is 0.45x. So at this point, he's held on to 54% of his original amount. If he spends the remaining $17 on a gift for his friend Keith and he has retained 54% so far, that $17 is 54% of his total money. Let's have a look at an application of percentages. Here we have simple interest and compound interest. Simple interest is simple. It's the same amount every single period and can be calculated by multiplying the principal, which is also the initial value, whether that's an investment or a loan, R, which is the annual rate of interest in percentages. So if you're given a rate such as 3% per month, 2% per week, you need to ensure that it's an annual rate of interest. So if it's a weekly rate, you multiply that by 52. If it's a monthly rate, you multiply that by 12. And then T, the time in years. Compound interest works so that the interest rate calculated is based on the previous value. So your initial value, after 1 year, the interest is calculated on the initial value. At the end of the second year, the interest is calculated from the value at the end of the first year. Now, the final amount of compound interest can be found by multiplying the principal value, or the initial value, by 1 plus R over N, where R is the interest rate, N is the number of times interest is applied per time period, to the power of NT, where T is the number of periods elapsed. So, the number of times interest is applied per time period will depend on the question. Sometimes the question will say monthly, biannually, semi-annually, weekly, fortnightly, daily. You need to be sure you put the right number into N depending on what the question says. So if it's monthly, N is 12. If it's weekly, N is 52. If the question says biannually, N is 2. Let's have a look at this interest question. Chris and John both start with $1,000 in their bank accounts. Chris invests at 20% biannually for 1 year through compound interest, whereas John invests at 10% annually for 2 years through simple interest. Who has more money at the end of their investment period and by how much? Let's start off with Chris. So Chris earns 20% biannually for 1 year through compound interest. So let's use the formula. A is equal to the principal amount, in this case it's 1,000, times, in brackets, 1 plus the rate, so 20%. Now, this needs to be in decimal form. So 0.2 divided by n. My n here comes from the biannually, so 2, as its n is the number of times compound interest is applied in 1 year. So 2 to the power of n times t. My n is 2 and my t is 1, since this investment lasts 1 year. So 2 times 1 is just 2. We can do 1,000 times 1.1 to the power of 2. That means 1,000 times 1.21, which is equal to $1,210. All right, let's look at John now. John invests at 10% annually for 2 years through simple interest. Now, for simple interest, interest is calculated on the initial value. It doesn't matter what comes after that, it's always on the initial value. So he also invests $1,000. 10% of $1,000 is $100. So he earns $100 interest for every period. He invests annually for 2 years, which means he has 2 periods of interest. So at the end of those 2 years, he has $1,200. So therefore, Chris has more money at the end of the investment period by $10. So here are some helpful tips. Remember the difference between simple and compound interest. Simple interest is simple because it is the same amount over time. It is always a percentage of the original value. Compound interest is one that compounds over time and becomes very large. Interest is calculated based on the previous value. So at the end of year 1, it's based on the initial value. At the end of the second year, it's based on the year 1 value. And don't forget to convert properly between decimals and percentages. Divide a percentage by 100 to get a decimal, and multiply a decimal by 100 to get the percentage. Remember, in the compound interest formula, your rate should be in decimal form. I hope you guys found this video helpful. Thanks for listening.